una, nag-ano lang kami sa nanay ko, nakitira lang kami. Nakapagtrabaho ako, nagrenta kami ng bahay ng mga bata. Pagkatapos, nag-apply ako ng ganito na sa housing ng babahay. Kasi may ejection letter naman kami noon. Single mother, wala ang trabaho, walang inaasahan. Talagang ako lang.
Ang bahay namin kasi sira na eh. Naabot na ba ma'am ng tubig, nung baha? Palagi lang ko nag-uusap sa Panginoon. Nga sabi ko, Lord, tulungan mo lang ako nga parang may ibang tao nga nakatulong man sa amin, nga may matitirahan kami. Naranasan ko talaga ma'am ang buhay namin dun. Napakahirap talaga.
Nakatira po kasi kami dati sa Maynila. Hindi naman kasi na kami nagtagal doon kasi nga binabaha din. Kaya nagdesisyon kami nung asawa ko na umuwi na lang dito sa Negros. Pagdating pala namin dito, baha rin pala. Pag naulan talaga, umaabot siya ng 1 linggo, 2 linggo bago siya humupa. Kasi siyempre marami na yung lamok. At saka pag nag-ano kami ng kusina namin, nalubog ka talaga dito.
Nabigay na sa amin ng na habitat na kailangan magtrabaho kami dito para maka-avail kami ng bahay. So kahit wala akong pera, nanghiram ako sa mga kapatid ko, pamasahe papunta rito. Talaga, ginawa ko lahat sa umpisa, yung pagtambak ng mga lupa. Hanggang sana talaga nabuo na to, na ganito na, nung nakita namin, Diyos ko, ang ganda ng bahay natin.
May 5 kami naglumipat dito, linggo. Kasi gusto na daw ng babae ko nga makalipat na kami. Kasi masayang masaya siya. Nag-sign language sa akin nga bibili daw ng TV. Kaya nakita na dito nga may kuryente. Sabi ko, sige mag-iipon tayo ng pera.
Happy talaga ako kahit papano. Umpisa talaga kami ng bagong bahay namin. Pasalamat talaga dahil hindi na kami makakaranas ng ganung baha. Bago namin negosyo, siguro ganun. Yung isda nga, inuumpisahan na. Yung pinaparami. Para baka lang sakali, success.
Tapos tingin ako sa bubong, Diyos ko, Lord, salamat, may bahay na ako. Iba pala yung pakiramdam na iyo na talaga. Yung inyo na kayo na talaga ang may-ari. Relax na talaga, ma'am. Nakapapasalamat ako sa Habitat, lalo na sa May Foundation na nagbigay ng bahay sa amin. Para binigyan nila kami ng inspiration ba na mabuhay ng maayos.
Nagpapasalamat ako kay Mayor sa tulong niya din sa amin, kay Ma'am Marites Alabayong. Nagpapasalamat kami sa kanya, ma'am, nga kung hindi sa kanya, wala kami dito ng bahay. Lahat-lahat ng staff ng Habitat, nagpapasalamat kami sa kanila.
Sana maging success pa yung proyekto nila, na magtagal ng ganun. Saka marami pa silang matutulungan na katulad naming mahihirap.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the BAHAYnihan Forum organized by Habitat for Humanity Philippines and Habitat's Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter in partnership with University of Asia and the Pacific Center for Research and Communication. My name is Jamel Alindogan. I'm your moderator for this session. And personally, I just want to share why I also look forward to moderating this session. As you know, I am a journalist who has covered numerous natural disasters for the past 13 years. I am actually personally a survivor of Typhoon Haiyan. For those of you who know, it struck Leyte on November 8, 2013. I was on a seaside beach in Palo, and my work as a journalist also exposed me to the suffering of so many for in the months leading up to that, and to the efforts of both government and private, basically, to provide decent shelter. It's the same thing with Marawi as well, where I covered the war from start to finish, and how, as well, it remains to be a really sticky issue for civilians who have all been, wanting to return to their homes. So I think this 1.5 session, there is a lot to unpack, and we have a lot of experts who are here to join us, both from government and non-governmental organizations, both here and abroad. And they will help us provide the latest information about Philippine housing issue. This is a topic that is very close, of course, like I said, to me personally. We've seen this before, and we've just posted on the screen few house rules and reminders. And we hope that you are to be just have a look at these, what you see on screen, and we hope that this will ensure a smooth and interactive session. Now, to start off our BAHAYnihan forum, we will hear from Mr. Luis Noda, the Asia Pacific Vice President of Habitat for Humanity International, who is originally from Bolivia. Luis has more than 27 years of extensive international relief and development experience, and before joining Habitat, he had held various leadership roles with extensive nonprofit management experience with Food for the Hungry. Please welcome Luis, joining us from Washington, D.C., sir. Good evening. I guess from your end. Good evening.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. Magandang umaga. Kumasta kayo? It is my great
Good morning,
pleasure
Mr. Noda.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to BAHAYnihan, Rising Together Through Housing, this webinar organized by Habitat for Humanity Philippines and the Habitat's Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter and the Center for Research and Communications. In more than 3 decades of building homes, communities, and hope in the Philippines, we have seen how Filipinos' resilience shines amid adversity. The COVID-19 pandemic is exacting a heavy toll on people's health and livelihoods, but we are uplifted by stories of families who have built strength, stability, and self-reliance through shelter. And in this moment, I would like to refer to one of the persons that have achieved to do that together with her family. Joanne was in her teens when her family became the first Habitat homeowner in Bacolod City, Negros Occidental, in 1999. Instead of having to rebuild their hut after each typhoon, Joanne and her family found stability in a secure home. Trained as a nurse, Joanne now not only takes care of her aging parents, but also provides medical care to the local community members nowadays. Joanne's story is the silver lining in these uncertain times. With an estimate of 4 million people housing units needed in 2015, many Filipinos still lack safe and affordable shelter. Dr. Winston Conrad Padohinog will share more insights from a recent study of clearing the housing backlog. Before the COVID-19 outbreak, families were already struggling in adequate and healthy housing. And as the pandemic continues, these families will face even more hardship due to the crisis health and economic fallouts. We will learn more from Naim Razwani when he shares he's part of the Terwilliger Center's study, and he will share about the impact of COVID-19 in the Philippines' low-income market systems. The housing affordability gap is not a problem that anyone can solve alone. But be it in this moment of global crisis or for a sustainable future, let us work together to ensure that every Filipino has a decent place to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. We'll talk about, we will be talking to another, we will be hearing from another speaker who will talk about this Clearing the Housing Backlog study. He is an associate professor of industrial economics and strategic management. His research expertise revolved around industry and business dynamics and policy, business sustainability, and strategy. He has worked with many businesses, industry associations, local government units, and non-government organizations in policy and strategy issues, and work focused on promoting an enlightened private sector in the pursuit of the common good of society. One of his areas of interest is property economics, and he is presently the fourth president of the University of Asia and Pacific, Dr. Winston Conrad Paduhinog, or Dr. Stan. Thank you and good morning po.
Good morning, Jamela. Thank you so much. I also would like to thank Habitat and Terwilliger for this organizing this forum. I also would like to welcome everyone, and I'd like to greet everyone a good day. Before I proceed, I just like to share with you that we will not just be focusing on the backlog per se, but on a very particular and specific segment, and I think which LGUs and even industry associations like my friends in SHEDA and OSHDAP will be able to consider. Allow me to share my own slide. I hope you won't mind. I will continue. Is a very specific segment that Habitat has told us to focus on. These are actually people who cannot afford. They cannot join the formal system of financing, and yet they have security of land tenure. They have actually lands, but they cannot afford to avail of financing to improve their housing conditions. Well, they start normally as temporary housing, but if you ask them, and if you have heard recently from the presentation, they really want to upgrade and improve their lifestyle, their living conditions. They have actually incomes, but excuse me, to address the condition, first is to help them, to help these ODCs access quality building materials, and also to help construction and construction-related companies to focus in this very specific and particular market, the ODC. The ODC segment actually in our study conforms to and overlaps with those who cannot afford segment. These are people who have the land, they have the purchasing power, but unfortunately, based on the conditions that have been imposed by lenders, at this point, they might be able to avail of financing. Based on our estimates, I think many of you will have access to that study that will be shared by Terwilliger and the Habitat for Humanity, that there will be, as estimated in 2018, we don't have yet the figures for 2019 production, but as of 2018, 5.6 million households is the backlog. And in that 5.6 million, that's where you can actually find this ODC segment, which could be another niche that can be considered by not only by policymakers, but by the LGUs and the industry associations as well. Based on our estimates, 55% of them and if unaddressed, this will continue to increase. by 2022, that's the end of, let's say, the present administration, 3.3 million households. No? And they are concentrated in many areas, no? Where affordability is a major issue. No? The top 3 regions where the ODCs are found are in Region 7, Region 12, and in Region 4A. No? Now, just to share with you the latest projections that we have, if you could look at how the housing segments are categorized according to price range. The first 3, socialized, economic, and low cost, are the ones that are rates regulated by policy. And there you could see that most of the backlogs, as far as mass housing is concerned, economic, low cost, and mid cost, that's where socialized, economic, and low cost, that's where most of the backlogs can be found. No? Now, you also consider the unserved segment. These are the ones who cannot really afford. They're also part, actually. And in the estimate that we have given here, they're not even included in the backlog simply because they cannot afford. But if you consider them, you're looking at about 11 million, at least 11 million people, no, who cannot have what we call decent housing. No? Now, what we need to see here is a very unique situation in the Philippines. No? Why do we have a situation like this? No? I know we don't have much time, but I would like to just give you a summary on the area of production. No? Issues facing, let's say, developers. I'm just focusing on the developers at this point, but there are many other issues as well. First, the build projects of government, and at the same time, the boom in other sectors of the economy, like your industrial zones, your retail, commercial, your hotels, commercial office buildings. They have actually been also competing in a limited pool, no, of skilled workers. And who are the skilled workers we're talking about? These are your master electricians, these are your plumbers, no? These are your carpenters, no? Etc. So that one is a very scarce resource even before the pandemic hit us. So that's why it's one of the factors. Second is input costs. No? The cost of land has been increasing, the cost of labor has been increasing, and so are the materials are increasing. And by the way, I'm not just referring to tangible costs, there are intangible costs as well. No? Another input cost is time. No? So it takes a while, for example, to process documents, to seek approvals in housing projects, and it also generate what we call costs, no, for the developers. And of course, given that situation, so you have a segment there, housing segments that are regulated in terms of prices, and there are other segments like upper class housing and upper end housing, which is unregulated. You could see that if I were a typical producer, I will deploy my resources to high margin projects. That's why in the estimates I presented to you earlier, there is actually a surplus in other segments. No? But when I say a surplus, it doesn't mean that no one is buying that surplus. No? Meaning, there are people buying that surplus in the middle class and the upper class housing, not really because of end user purposes, but more for investments, no? More for speculation, no? More for perhaps as a vacation house, etc. So it doesn't mean that there is a weak demand on that. There's another aspect of demand. No? But the study that we're focusing on is really the demand coming from households, real households that need housing, no? Specifically decent housing. No? And what happened overall? So what happened is that the production capacities are stalled. It hasn't really increased. If you look at the figure I'm sharing with you, this is just an average annual demand that's been increasing by 620,000 households per year. but we can only supply 256,000. And if you look at the average supply coming out from mass housing, which includes economic, socialized, and low-cost housing, is also limited. And year in, year out, we generate deficits, housing deficits in this particular segment, and at the same time, the unserved segment where you can find your ODCs. So every year, we accumulate these deficits, and in the end, what we have is a backlog. Where can we find this unserved segment? So this particular slide will show to you the distribution of this unserved segment. I think many of you can get a copy of the study and see the specific breakdown of this one. Where can you find these ODCs? Those that have the characteristics of they have land, they have purchasing power, which is give them enough decent income. By the way, the incomes these are incomes from gardening, driving, sari-sari stores, etc. You can clearly see that they are scattered all over the regions where affordability is an issue. So we're looking at the ODC, the segment, and then down to very specific areas from regions to provinces. You can actually see that there are what we call significant numbers of ODCs found in this unserved segment. Remember, they have land as well. They have purchasing power. But what is important now is how do we capitalize on that? So here you can find the breakdowns. Again, we don't have much time to really focus on the details, but you could see that once again, they are even found in urban centers. Very interestingly, Davao region as well. And remember, these regions, that's the last comment, are regions that are growing faster than the National Capital Region, growing faster than the traditional commercial centers. So let me just go to the findings. If we want to cater to this ODC segment in the unserved market, you could looking at about $12.8 billion worth of construction activity. But if you look at the behavior of these households, because of the limited income they have, they can only allocate 2%, or about $134 million. So that means we need to bridge this gap, and will involve affordable financing assistance, and of course, indirect government subsidy, including the channeling of private developer compliances on balanced housing towards this sector. I heard earlier before we started the need for partnerships. It's the LGUs, for example, that have the land. They can actually lower down the cost if this land is provided for by LGUs. And remember, by 2022, based on the decision of the Supreme Court, a large portion of the national taxes will be allocated to LGUs. And you can just imagine the amount of resources on the hands of LGUs. And I agree with the thrust of the industry associations like OSHDAP and SHEDA and even Habitat to partner with LGUs in addressing not only the ODCs, but the unserved segment and the backlogs. And then a significant size of this, in a conclusion, cannot participate because due to lack of affordability. The accumulated backlog, excluding those who cannot afford, is 5.6 million. So the unserved and socialized and economic segments account for almost half of the total households in 2015, which is parallel to the 2015 census, really leaving around 35% who do not own or have owner-like possession of properties. This is based on a census done by government. So simply, the study tends to validate what government statistics have also gathered. And finally, the policy direction of government related to housing at the moment, that's unfortunately, have really largely ignored this unserved segment, no? Or nor the backlog. So the persistence and widening of this backlog indicates that the responses that have been made over the last few years have been inadequate, if ever there were any effective responses. And finally, the unserved segment and the ODCs are outside presently the purview of many policies. Perhaps, or current policies, there may be existing policies, but they haven't been addressed at the moment. Maybe it can be addressed by collaboration and coordination between and among the different stakeholders involved. So that, let me see, the sheer size of the OC segment also, and its concentration in some areas can provide scale, perhaps, for stakeholders who come to address their needs. And as I have said earlier, the government, through DHSAD, LGUs, and the private sector developers and the NGOs, can partner with them, and who knows, make use of the recent law on balanced housing, no, to address not only the ODCs, but the backlog as well. No? So I will be able to address maybe many of the questions, but thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
In today's complex business environment, success boils down to finding the right insights. That's where the Center for Research and Communication can help you. Since being conceived in 1967, CRC has continuously provided innovative business advice, tapping a diverse pool of experts across a tapestry of different fields. Over the years, CRC's research output has made immediate impacts in a wide array of sectors, including energy, retail, sustainable development, beverages, manufacturing, and housing. CRC can help you with economic analysis, business strategy development, regulatory impact studies, financial analysis, market research, project impact analysis, project feasibility studies, industry conference organizing, continuing education, and specialized technical research. CRC, the research and consultancy partner of the University of Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stan. And our next speaker will present the impact of COVID-19 on the low-income housing market systems in the Philippines. He is currently the Global Director for Financial Inclusion and Capital Markets of Habitat for Humanity's Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter. Mr. Naeem Razwani is responsible for designing strategic roadmaps and implementation models to improve access to housing and finance in developing markets. He has led interventions to engage, onboard, and manage a diverse set of stakeholders within the finance ecosystem in over 10 countries in the Asia Pacific and the Middle East, and of course, North African regions as well. Under his leadership, TCIS has helped 760,000 families have access to better housing services from 2016 to 2019. Mr. Razwani, thank you for talking to us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jamila. It's an honor to be presenting with some honorable and most knowledgeable people when it comes to the housing context of the Philippines. And once again, congratulations to CRC, Habitat for Humanity, and the Terwilliger Center for organizing such an important session, which is close to our heart and close to our minds. I would just take a lead from Dr. Stan's presentation, and I see a lot of comments going around what does ODC stands for. So ODC stands for Owner-Driven Construction. Globally, about 85% of the low-income households construct their houses being the project managers themselves, either by managing or designing the project themselves or hiring the right level of skill set to what their needs are. So just take an example of one of our colleagues or one of our members who probably is living in the suburb or the peri-urban or the urban areas of the Philippines. And when he wants to build his house, what does he have to look up to? And this is the kind of thinking that we need. So overall, the report that I'll be presenting today analyzes the economic and the social impact of COVID-19 on low-income household market systems in the Philippines. and the effectiveness of the institutional support that have been planned and provided to the low-income housing market actors to lessen the impact of COVID-19. Housing and COVID-19 has become critically important as shelter or staying back home has become synonymous to each other in this fight from the pandemic. Previously, where you had one or two people left behind as the rest of the family was going out to work, now you have suddenly five people within a congested housing space trying to save them from the COVID virus or the coronavirus that is out there, but rather not being able to maintain social distancing because of the limited space that they have available to live in. We also wanted to identify the current challenges and opportunities for the housing industry and what does it bring as a business opportunity. As already mentioned by CRC, the low-income housing market systems were already burdened even before the COVID strike. The Philippines had projected around 15 million by 2022, of which 5.9 million already belonged to the unserved segment. Another interesting thing to note is that in 2018, socialized housing actually declined from 14% to 9%. And because of the housing, the slowing down of the housing production, you also see a downward trend from 2014 to 2018, where it moved from 42% to 34% when it comes to housing production. I'll go to the next slide, please. The COVID-19 pandemic deepened the crisis further. According to the National Housing Authority, 10% of the housing projects are expected to be affected. This may cause a 12% decrease in house completion projects and 32% decrease in housing units. The delivery of housing projects are delayed. There is an expected 15 to 20% drop in housing prices by the end of the year. Construction output growth forecast is also expected to slow down to 1.2% from 8% based on the global data statistics. And when we talk about the housing construction activities slowing down, just look at how does it affect the whole value chain system? How does it affect the material supplier? How does it impact the daily wagers who are supposed to work on these projects to be able to earn something to take bread at the end of the day to their families? However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the house building plans of 79% of households have also been affected. 52% of low-income households fully stop construction work, while 18% don't have any plan to start within the year. So if you look at everything is so correlated or directly proportional to how the rest of the industry reacts to this situation, and that is where the need of addressing the owner-driven construction becomes critically important. On the next slide, we present the COVID-19, how it has impacted the homeowners. Based on the study, 52% of the low-income household, as I shared earlier, fully stopped their construction work. It was a choice between bread and choice between comfort and safety. Of the surveyed households, 80% primarily financed homes or home construction from savings, while 18% don't have any plans to start it within the year. The owner-driven construction, if you look at how do they finance their project, if they're not reaching out to a financial institution, it's all about save a little and build a little. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, where the economic crisis has taken an unprecedented turn, we see that the savings of a lot of people have already been gone away or has been taken away just to maintain the food supplies within their houses. Due to the pandemic, 68% of the low-income households are not able to save anymore, which may dampen the demand further. And that is exactly where the role of the government and the private sector, and particularly the financial institutions, come up, because the needs of the market has changed. On the next slide, the slide that we see here, we talk about the small, medium enterprises. We can go to the previous slide, please. The micro, small, and medium enterprises, who are the backbone of the developing economy and the developing world, supply the materials, and the whole system is badly affected, causing a revenue drop of 50 to 60%. If there's no construction happening, there is no materials being purchased. If there are no materials being purchased, there is no skilled labor being hired to install those materials. So now you see the correlation between the two. Extension on payments of debts from customers increasing, the credit burden for the retailers. To recover, each retailer will require approximately 41 million Filipino pesos working capital for support. So one thing is the working capital because that is the fuel of how a business runs. So if you're not doing your sales, you're not getting the revenue. And when you're not getting the revenue, you're not able to pay the suppliers that you're getting the material from. And if the suppliers don't receive money, as I said earlier, and I've said multiple times, the whole ecosystem gets affected. Additionally, ensuring safety protocols at workplace and projects created additional cost burden for the construction companies, private sector, and NGOs. Then I would probably take a closer look at it. While working from home is important, how many of us have actually felt the burden of increasing the cost of our consumption? You've got more electricity bills, you've got more food supplies, you've got to get a better internet connection, even to work from home. So technically, while we are trying to be safe from COVID impact, there's a direct correlation between the cost that has to be incurred. And that what we all can feel on an individual and personal basis. Next slide, please. Through a sectorial heat map, we analyze the economic and social impact of COVID-19 on the housing market system and the effectiveness of the institutional support that have been planned and provided so far for the low-income housing market sectors to lessen the COVID-19 crisis. The sectorial heat map is expected to help policymakers, development partners, the private sector, NGOs, and researchers to better understand the status of low-income housing markets in the Philippines. What we found based on the ranking exercise is that the low-income housing sector is another way to revitalize the deepening economic crisis. This means that even if the impact on these sectors have been strong, the impact have been recognized by the government and the development partners. However, without strategic support, the low-income housing sector can get to a downturn, which may actually require a complete reboot. End of the day, what does this all mean? What does the data mean? And what does the data states? On the next slide, the Philippines Development Plan for 2017 and 2022 and Ambition Natin 2040 targets might not be achieved without a cash injection, safety net support, and stimulus packages for the sector. As we mentioned, there is no need to reboot the low-income housing market as of now if right systems and right approaches can be activated and be installed. Stronger coordination and collaboration between the private, public, and not-profit sector is critically important to reboot or revitalize the system as it stands off today. If immediate actions are taken to boost demand and supply of the housing market systems, we may see that a further deepening of the crisis can be averted. Housing system needs to be taken with a viewpoint of an integrated health systems to adapt to the new normal. Most importantly, there's a call for more attention, there's a call for more investment, and there is a call for creating an enabling environment for greater innovation into the owner-driven construction model. Emerging economies struggle to recover from COVID-19 pandemic, and the pandemic may be significantly underestimating how much their housing sector contributes to the gross domestic product. And as a result, missing opportunities for economic and social revival. The recent study that we launched in partnership with the Wharton School of Business, there was an interesting insight that came up that the housing is just being considered as the brick and mortar construction that we see. We usually forget the housing services that come in with construction of each of the houses, the kind of electric appliances you buy, the kind of supplies that you build in to improve the internal environment of your house also plays a huge role in increasing the GDP or plays a huge role to the GDP contribution. Next slide, please. In the Philippines, the undercount of the entire housing sector contributes to the country's GDP is already $29 billion. And please, I would restate this. We are talking about $29 billion and not just Filipino pesos. And that also talks about the opportunity that brings with itself. On the next slide. Additionally, there is an actual market opportunity to drive more investments into owner-driven construction segment. just because we feel that the people who are not able to submit a security to a commercial bank in the local market, to the likes of the BPI or the PDOs in this market, doesn't really mean that these people do not find other alternates to meet their housing needs. Their needs are very real and their solutions are also very real. The question would be, how can we design client-centric, human-centric design approaches and products and services? Either they're from the supply side, either they're from the material side, either they're from the legislations or the policymakers, or even the financial institutions. We all need to work together to build on this opportunity, which translates into a 260 billion pesos market value. To conclude, let's start with housing. Let's make housing more visible, design policies right, let's make market more inclusive, and let's put the end user, the beneficiary, the owner who constructs the house himself to the center. That would help in reigniting the economic activities within the whole housing supply and demand value chain. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Naeem. Of course, that's just the first part of our program. We're moving on to the second part where we'll be hearing from our panel of reactors. And the first one is someone who has been the NEDA Undersecretary for National Development Policy and Planning. Ms. Rosemary Edilion shepherds the formulation, implementation, and monitoring of the Philippine Development Plan. She provides technical advice on policy issues to both the legislative and executive branches of the government. She also leads the Task Force Group on Recovery under the National Task Force Against COVID-19 and the Technical Working Group on Anticipatory and Forward Planning, holding a PhD also in economics. Yusek Edilion heads the Secretariat of the Economic Development Cluster of the Cabinet and is currently a board member of the Philippine Economic Society. Good morning, ma'am.
Yes, hello, good morning. Yeah, thank you very much for hosting this this online forum. Truly, this is very timely. It's really important that we become aware, or we let everyone know how this COVID-19 pandemic is actually affecting each and every sector of our society. And this is really important. And truth be told, with respect to the housing sector, as already pointed out, most of the problems are actually, have been there since pre-COVID. And now that COVID is here, and it brought to light some other issues, but as with the rest, it's actually amplified the weaknesses of the sector. First of all, I'd like to thank the two presenters. These two reports are really very welcome. They're new references in the housing supply and demand, and especially for the unserved segment. Thank you for putting light into this sector of the owner-driven construction. Truly, this is something that we really need to discuss plenty more. But I would like to say as well that, as already mentioned by the first presenter, that the challenges in this sector are very complex, and they are compounded by the current pandemic. And the whole of society approach, therefore, is desirable to keep everyone healthy and establish resilient housing communities. So we affirm the urgency to address the growing need for adequate housing, especially for the lowest income household, in view of with the objective of increasing their resilience to withstand natural, including the effects of climate change and human-induced disasters. And we also recognize that the current COVID-19 has amplified the need to improve the quality of living conditions, especially of vulnerable households living in highly dense community. I just would like to share as well that addressing this enormous housing need has always been challenged by a confluence of structural and transactional factors. So this include your institutional bottlenecks, particularly the complex and tedious processing and approval of housing permits, licenses, clearances, the lack of land suitable for socialized housing development, especially in the urban areas. Low agency budget allocation and utilization, in addition to what has already been mentioned by Dr. Stan earlier. Now, let me just share with you the midterm update of our Philippine Development Plan. We have actually updated it to to take into consideration all this the new situation brought about by the COVID. We have identified the strategies under three subsector outcomes. So this is still in Chapter 12, building safe, resilient, and sustainable communities. First, public health goals in the design of human settlements will be integrated. Second, housing construction that incorporates hazard and health standards will also be accelerated. And then third, alternative housing solutions for low-income market will be adopted. And we have the cross-cutting strategy of empowerment of stakeholders to be intensified to ensure the sustainability of housing program implementation. So the findings of these studies can serve as reference in crafting housing microfinance and direct subsidies and other related interventions, especially for those belonging to the lowest income household. The second point I'd like to make is that there are recommendations in the two reports that are consistent with the strategies that are already in the updated PDP. So we have noted, for instance, first is on clearing the housing backlog, where the study says that we need an updated supply and demand study on the unserved owner-driven construction segment in the Philippines. The report's recommendation is on offering affordable financing assistance and schemes and indirect government subsidy, including the channeling of private developer compliances on balanced housing requirements. The PDP, the updated PDP, talks about implementing innovative housing finance modalities. Of course, the institutional and policy reforms to be the platform of all this, to accelerate housing microfinance to be formulated by the newly created Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development. So we have actually listed some possible financing strategies like direct subsidies, of course, through housing vouchers, public rental housing, housing microfinance models, and probably even Islamic financing schemes. This is really to ensure that the rationalized tax incentives for socialized housing in compliance with the train law, that's RA 10963, and that we want that it will directly benefit the low-income household. And then further, a feasibility study and pilot implementation of the housing voucher and public rental housing modalities will be pursued by the DSUD. And this is actually in Chapter 12 of the updated PDP. Next is looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the low-income housing market systems. So the report talks about promoting savings practices because most of this, of course, this ODC is actually financed out of savings. So in PDP Chapter 11, we talk about savings mobilizations, mainly through the financial literacy and advocacy program of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. And an important element of this strategy is encouraging households to have a bank account. And right now, our advocacy, hopefully to happen in the next few months, is really tying this up with the registration to the PhilSys, the national ID. In terms of we welcome the report's suggestion that we should protect employment and not jobs. It talks about having flexibility. Talks about also strategies like skills retooling and extension. And this is also included in the PDP Chapter 10, where we talk about further advancing skills development and retooling through continuing education, training, and digital learning. Earlier, it was mentioned that we are having tight labor supply actually with respect to the high skilled construction sector. Uh, in fact, we are being proactive as well in securing the skills registry of all those OFWs that have come back. We think that some of them are also construction related, and actually what will happen is that again, supposedly November 1 is the launching. I don't know why they chose that date. November 1 is the launching of a new form of the field job net, and this will actually very aggressively seek out all those OFWs who have returned. So I encourage all the construction companies to actually begin visiting the field job net probably towards the middle of November. So um yeah, so overall we are happy with the report, and we think this is very useful. We will surely be looking more carefully into the recommendations, and really that we should address this. As already mentioned, this is really part of the ambition natin 2040. We are really concerned about how this COVID-19 has set us back a few years with respect to our ability to achieve the this ambition, but we are really we are resolved that we should really catch up. Now with respect to some questions with respect to the report, there's a report, there's a mention there that the target of 7 million new affordable homes for the period 2023 to 2030. We would like to clarify this because in the PDP, the old and the updated, there was really no mention of a target of 7 million. But instead, what we specified is a total housing need of the country is approximately 6.8 million units for the period 2017 to 2022. And then there was mention of a price ceiling for socialized housing. And there's actually a need to update the footnote on this one because the HUD-C will now be is now actually discussing this, and they will implement a three-tiered socialized housing price ceiling with corresponding revised minimum floor area. So this is based on HUD-C resolution number 1 series of 2018, as well as the price ceiling for socialized condominium per HUD-C resolution number 2 series of 2018. So that's all the comments I have, Secretariat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yusek. Will be the next speaker will be representing Secretary Ed Del Rosario, who is unfortunately unable to join us today. He will be represented by Director Rowena Dineros, who is part of the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, OIC for Public Housing and Settlement Services. Director Dineros has an extensive senior level experience in shelter planning and housing and urban development policy formation, disaster recovery and rehabilitation, monitoring and evaluation, and advocacy, as she has also been working with the Housing Aid Urban Development Coordinating Council for 26 years. She's also the deputy head of the National Secretariat of the Task Force Bangon Marawi, or TFBM, an organization we're all familiar with. And it's an interagency task force for the recovery, reconstruction, and rehabilitation of Marawi City. Ma'am, Dr. Weng, good morning po.
Gandang umaga sa lahat. Thank you, Ms. Hamela, and our forum moderator, to Ms. Lily Fuentes, the COO for the Habitat for Humanity, and Mr. Luis Nota, the Area Vice President for Habitat for Humanity International, and of course to Dr. Stan for sharing us your study, your research, and also to Mr. Naim Raswani, the Financial Inclusion and Capital Markets of the Terwilliger Center for Innovation and Shelter, Habitat for Humanity International, and of course to Yusek Idelion from NEDA. Good morning, ma'am. A pleasant pleasant morning to us all. In behalf of Secretary Eduardo Del Rosario, our Secretary for the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, we would like to thank the Habitat for Humanity for this opportunity to be part of this event, the BAHAYnihan, Rising Together Through Housing. We in the SUD appreciate the rich information generated from these studies that reveal the adverse impacts of COVID-19 on the housing sector of the Philippines. These studies also underscore the urgency of putting in place a program of action among the government, private sector, and civil society to accelerate the recovery of a sector that has already been grappling with a significant demand-supply gap, specifically the underserved owner-driven construction segment prior to the pandemic. Further, the studies support the paradigm that the housing sector delivers the social function of the government and also serves as a contributor to economic growth. If met with a challenge like this pandemic, efforts to recover and rally behind the sector is of utmost importance. The housing sector bears the social function of the government, and with the public health issue of coronavirus pandemic, the impact to the sector is significant in terms of addressing the housing backlog of 6.8 million housing units. Per the SUD's data on local shelter plans, these plans are generated, prepared by the local government units, counting to 1,634 nationwide. The total count of underserved or informal settler families is 3.7 million. These ISF were evidently the hardest hit and vulnerable sector with the corona pandemic due to unhygienic environment and constricted living spaces. The unquantifiable effect of provision of security of tenure, especially to the lower segments of the society, is a function of better health conditions and lower budgetary requirements for health sector. Furthermore, better housing policies can be correlated to an improved peace and order situation and a more productive labor force and citizenry. As mentioned earlier by Yusek Idelion, for 2017, next slide please. For 2017-2022, under the Philippine Development Plan, the government sets a target of direct housing assistance of 1.5 million under the National Shelter Program, which is the anchor housing program of the government. The PDP's midterm review reveals that there still remains a target of 1.148 610,000 direct housing assistance, of which 74% or 855,000 are targeted assistance for the poor. Addressing this PDP target is constrained with limited budget to the housing sector, with less than 1% against the total national budget for the last 10 years, and coupled with this public health issue, which hit the entire country early this year to present. Presently, with the newly created Department of Human Settlements in Urban Development, there are several interventions were done with the DSUD as the lead agency on housing, human settlement, urban development concerns. And through department orders, next slide please. Through the department, through the department orders, advisories, memorandums, circulars were issued to mitigate the impact of the pandemic to the sector as follows. We have issued a department advisory which provide a 3-month moratorium on loan payments to the department's attached agencies, particularly the Pag-ibig National Housing Authority, the Social Housing Finance Corporation, and National Home Mortgage Finance Corporation. This has commenced in March 17, early of this year, the first quarter at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. This covered an aggregate amount of 31.4 billions and benefited total members or borrowers, beneficiaries of 5,521,000 4,611. Another department order issued is the provision of a grace period on payment by buyers under in-house financing plans of private project owners development of the ECQ, plus a 1-month grace period after the lifting of the is covered by the Department of Human Settlements during the COVID-19 public health emergency. And of course, pertaining to the homeowners, we enjoined them through a department advisory. We enjoined homeowners associations and their federations, confederations, or umbrella organizations to assist the government in the strict implementation of ECQ, GCQ protocols within their communities. And also, we have a study through the ADB, through the Matatag, which was convened by the National Economic Development Authority and chaired by the NEDA. We were able to have this technical assistance. We're provided with the TA by the Asian Development Bank, which we're doing currently now, which is a study to formulate the roadmap for how to scale up green inclusive finance in the Philippines. This includes the housing microfinance, which is seen as a pro-poor financing, which is also espoused by the sector, as mentioned earlier by Yusek Edelion, as one of the financing modalities under the Enhanced Philippine Development Plan of 2017 to 2022. Recently also, with CHEDA, the Subdivision and Housing Developers Association and Habitat for Humanity, we have penned MOA, Memorandum of Agreement, which is basically to address provision at the local level through local shelter planning. The department formed partnerships with leading housing organizations and NGOs through an effort geared at addressing the housing need at the local level by partnering with LGUs with approved local shelter plans and translating these local shelter plans into actual housing projects activities. In resuscitating the Philippine economy, the housing sector plays a pivotal role. Since housing is a generator of employment and has a 3.44 output multiplier effect, this came from a study did by Dr. Stan together with Sheda in 2017. So, and also, as to the contribution to total employment, housing activities generate substantial direct employment with an average of 8.3 laborers for 3 weeks or 124 man-days, or an average of approximately 5% of the total country's total employment. Next slide, please. The slides here. Next slide, please. Through the continuous production of housing units, more employment opportunities are being generated for laborers and other workers. And as seen here, we have out of the 501,000 produced housing units, new jobs created are 4,104,869. And as to the output of multiplier effect under the normal circumstances, the housing sector or the industry activities have been recognized as an economic pump primer, contributing a 3.44 output multiplier effect on the economy. This is due basically to 80 plus allied industries attached to housing, settlements, and urban development sector. This is based on a study made by the CRC or the University of Asia Pacific under the helm of Mr. Paduhinog in collaboration with SHEDA. Why the need for the housing sector to double its efforts to reverse the adverse social and economic impacts of COVID-19? It is imperative for the housing sector to do such for the following reasons. Housing cuts across all sectors, and the current standstill affects the country's overall economic growth and development. The sector's contribution to the economy is substantial since housing production creates jobs and has an economic multiplier effect of 3.44. And NEDA recently has announced that poverty in the Philippines will worsen as a direct result of COVID-19 within the urban areas bearing most of the brunt. This will translate to a further deterioration in the income and livelihoods, as well as the public health and quality of millions of lives of informal settler families. So far, the DSUD has identified, next slide please, priority activities that would strengthen the sector's efforts vis-a-vis the challenges of COVID pandemic and build the pathway to livable, climate resilient, and more environmentally sustainable communities in an inclusive Philippines. One that is equitable, participatory, and provides universal access to quality services, especially for the vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. Such as these activities are the enhancement of synergy and greater participation of the private sector, the community stakeholders, and the local government units in the housing activities, especially at the regional level, such as the PPP mentioned earlier with the SHEDA and Habitat for Humanity. Provision of more conducive climate for housing activities. Right now, we have this ease of doing business through incentives and simplification and digitalization of permitting process and establishment of HAPCs, housing one-stop processing centers. And we have to focus efforts in the implementation of public housing and other innovative, timely, and relevant programs for the lower income groups, such as the high-density rental housing and similar programs. And we have to ensure sustainable financing for housing, for both the housing development and end-user financing. DSUD currently is putting its efforts to ensure greater allocation of the housing sector from the budget pie of the government. And we are advocating for the approval of pending bills like the National Housing Production and Financing Act, the rental subsidy bill, and for the informal settler families, to name a few. In closing, may this online forum, Bayanihan Rising Together Through Housing, provide the forum not only in discussing the magnitude of the COVID-19 challenge to the housing sector, but for agreeing on the actions necessary to put us on track towards the building of inclusive and greener communities and serve as generators of economic development. Thank you and good day.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll move on to our next panelist. He's one of the country's housing sector leaders. Engineer Marcelino Mendoza represented the private sector in the Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council from 2018 to 2019, supporting the agency in crafting policies to address the housing backlog. Moving on to advocacy work, he also spearheaded the formation of the Socialized Housing Alliance Roundtable Endeavor, which served as a channel for discussions on housing reforms and upscaling the production of socialized housing units. He was also the chairman of the board of Vista Land and Lifescapes and president of Camellia Homes, the country's leading mass housing developer. Mr. Marcelino Mendoza is the chairman of the board of the Organization of Socialized and Economic Housing Developers of the Philippines. Good morning, sir.
NEDA's own government survey for Ambition 2040 suggests that for 61% of the respondents, owning a medium-sized house is among the most cherished of their ambitions. In the PSA report for the Philippine Development Plan last August 2019, the number of socialized housing units targeted to be delivered by 2022 at 1.08 million appears unlikely to be met, as it is only 193,174 on that date. All this, Dr. Stan Paduhino captures beautifully in these studies, with a huge backlog and shortage fully discussed. The socialized housing standards and ceilings are already up for review after 2 years, and we urge the government to convene for that purpose. While an average of only 26,676 socialized housing units were produced annually, the total production, 256,148 of various types, that's average per year, in economic, middle cost, and condominium segments. This is only around 10%, the socialized housing side. As the socialized housing backlog, as measured by Dr. Stan, is 4.8 million units, it will take really years to even make a dent if government intervention is not effective. I fully agree with the Terwilliger study that we have to protect employment, not jobs. We will not only have a loss in the rated capacity of artisans and construction workers, we will also be preventing part of the sector of the population, around 1.5 million, from falling in the cliff to poverty. I would suggest that what Dr. Stan terms as part of those who undertake ODC or owner-driven construction is part of this. Yes, Governor Ben Jokno says MSMEs account for 63% of all employment and 99% of all enterprises. They most probably belong to close to half of the 51 million Filipinos who do not have a bank account. I cannot but fully agree with Dr. Stan that this sector has substantial and significant numbers. Yet banks and even Pag-ibig are not fully servicing them now. This concern must be addressed. The best intervention that government can do is through the national budget or appropriations. With the COVID pandemic, housing and public health must be in tandem. Actual statistics from India showed a 50% incidence in the slums of Mumbai, what with very little social distancing and not much hand washing. The description of Dr. Stan of a typical owner-driven construction dwelling might be similar to the India situation in some respects. I just hope that the 2021 budget and succeeding budgets will give additional funds to these health concerns. Dr. Stan's study correctly points out the budget for housing has always been meager. In fact, it is only 0.08% share of the total 4.5 trillion 2021 budget of 4 billion, at 4 billion for housing. This is an Inquirer editorial of June 2019. That was last year. And this still applies as well in the deliberations of the current budget for 2021. But what I would like to point out will be the missed opportunities. These are the areas that the new Department of Human Settlements are mandated to undertake, but will probably not be pursuing because of limited funding. Number one, develop and manage idle government land. And this includes lands owned by LGUs. Number two, take over undeveloped and abandoned subdivisions. This is a new one, as well as number one, which is idle government land and LGU land. Number three, the new DSUD is mandated to manage and oversee the development of proclaimed socialized housing sites. We take note that non-government organizations like Habitat for Humanity can participate in joint ventures for these projects. We welcome this, and we want Habitat to maximize its capabilities. All of us know that massive government intervention is needed as either an enabler or as a direct participant, as in the cases of Singapore and even Indonesia's 1 million homes program, the later anchored on transit-oriented development, which fits well with our own Build, Build, Build program. We urge the government to strongly lobby with Congress and the Senate for increased funding, and we in the private and non-government sector will fully support this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Mars. We'll be moving on to last of our reactor, Ms. Rosie, hold on. Ms. Rosie Chai is the National President of the Subdivision and Housing Developers Association with over 20 years of experience in the real estate industry. Ms. Rosie Chai has widened her network by serving on the Board of Governors of the Subdivision and Housing Developers Association from 2009 to 2014. She subsequently got elected as its national president and a board member in 2017. She has also been the president and chief executive officer of City Homes Builder and Development Incorporated for 13 years, and she considers herself privileged and blessed to lead the company in the mission to help people achieve more meaningful lives by building homes and communities. Ms. Rosie, good morning.
Good morning and thank you, Hamela. Good morning, everybody. Greetings from Subdivision and Housing Developers Association, or SHEDA. Thank you, Habitat for Humanity International, represented today by the Asia Pacific Area Vice President, Mr. Luis Noda. Good morning, Neda Yusek Rosemary de Leon. Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, DSUD Director of Public Housing and Human Settlement Service, Direct Rowena or Weng Dineros. Respectable speakers, fellow reactors, and colleagues in the industry, good morning. Next, please. SHEDA is the country's leading organization of housing developers for both vertical and horizontal development. SHEDA celebrated its 50th founding anniversary this year and continues to work towards achievement of the goals of the housing sector. Its objectives are to promote the welfare of developers for a more vibrant housing industry, and most importantly, SHEDA partners with the government in addressing the country's housing needs. Next, please. The housing situation, especially for the low-income segment, is in crisis. Inadequate control of population growth, rapid urbanization continue to increase demand for living spaces. The global pandemic exposes an even more glaring situation. Next, please. Statistics on housing deficit show a widening gap between demand and supply, underscoring the need of the government to provide a conducive climate for private sector participation by addressing the need for in-city low-cost condominiums, access to land and identification of beneficiaries, fast-track permitting and licensing processes, direct subsidies for low-income families, lower interest rates for low-income segment borrowers, innovative and inclusive projects such as the Balay rental under DSUD and the LGU private sector partnership and synergies. Direct Weng mentioned about the SHEDA and the DSUD, SHEDA, and LGU memorandum of undertaking, and this is what we are trying to address. Next, please. SHEDA is much appreciative and commends the initiatives. Thank you. Commends the initiatives of the Habitat for Humanity for organizing this online forum, BAHAYnihan, rising together through housing. Sheda would like to put forward our comments and reactions to the first study, the clearing the housing backlog. Sheda fully supports this two-pronged strategy of the government. First is we want to take note that public housing for those who cannot afford or the unserved segment, including the ODC segment, should be the responsibility of the government. However, the government should encourage private sector participation through direct fiscal incentives in the form of income tax holidays and VAT or VAT exemption, while imposing the balanced housing requirements on developers catering to economic to high-end segments. Next, please. The study proposed providing, next please. The study proposed providing indirect government subsidy, which can include rechanneling of private developers' compliance on balanced housing requirements towards the ODC sector. Sheda supports this move relating to various alternative compliance options as long as they are accredited by the DSUD as compliance and by the Board of Investments as qualified for incentives. Next slide, please. The study noted as well that despite fiscal incentives and the adjustment in price ceiling for mass housing, the bulk of construction activities since 2016 has shifted to upper class housing where margins are more attractive or to other non-housing construction projects. I wish to clarify that the balanced housing requirement of the government requires subdivision developers to develop an area for socialized housing development equivalent to at least 15% of the total land area or total subdivision project cost, and for condominium developers, at least 5% of the condominium area or total project costs at the option of the developer. Socialized housing production, therefore, is directly proportionate to economic, low-cost, mid or high-end production in order to ensure continuous supply. Regarding the price ceiling adjustment, it is noteworthy to mention that Republic Act 10884 provides for the review and adjustment of price ceiling every 2 years. As Sir Mars mentioned, it is already time. It's outdated. The last price ceiling adjustment was in 2018. However, adjustment of 30,000 for socialized housing units from 450,000 to 480,000 came with an adjustment in design standards. That is, an increase in floor area from 18 to 24 square meters and the lot area from 32 to 36.75 or 37 square meters, which not only totally negates the price adjustment, but actually cuts into whatever negligible margins. For the second study, the impact of COVID-19 on low-income housing market systems, Sheda would like to note, next please. Sheda would like to note that the impact of COVID-19, particularly on the supply side, the studies conducted in-depth interview of the retailers of construction materials and construction materials manufacturers. Sheda believes that housing developers should be a part of the supply side of low-income housing market systems as developers mobilize the supply chains in providing for the material component of housing production. Next, please. On the other hand, the study identified construction workers and contractors under the support system of the housing market. Majority of contractors and construction workers are employed by developers. Housing developers are the prime movers who begin a project from scratch. From sourcing raw land, securing licenses, permits and clearances, mobilizing land development, including development of utilities and facilities, engaging in housing production through labor and material components, sourcing the buyers, processing the buyer's housing loans to pay himself only after completion of the units, turning over the completed units for move-in, educating homeowners to organize the homeowners associations, and final turnover of the housing project. For a 10-hectare project, the whole cycle takes 5 to 7 years or even more. Next, please. And the actual impact of COVID-19 on the housing industry. Before the pandemic, developers were doing fairly well, except for the long time problems of lengthy and tedious permitting and licensing processes. After the pandemic, developers suffered negative financial impact brought about by the drop in sales, especially for small to medium developers who are not ready to pivot to digitization. Another impact is the delays and reduction in collection as financing institutions needed to requalify housing loan borrowers previously determined as qualified. Likewise, more borrowers went into default. And the third is construction was forced to slow down while the cost of production increased due to the need for health and safety protocols and logistic problems. Delays in construction translates to delays in collection, which triggers a vicious cycle. All these factors and many others contributed to significant layoffs. Next, please. To support operations from day one in project development, developers have to go through 27 government agencies to secure 78 permits, licenses, or clearances, requiring 146 signatures and processing 373 documents. Due to the pandemics, delays in securing requirements from government offices is even further aggravated. Next, please. So here comes the question on how can the private sector help address the increasing housing gap intensified by COVID-19 global pandemic. The government should address the chronic need to streamline the permitting and licensing processes at the national and the local level, hopefully to reduce from 2 to 3 years to 6 months to a year for a project to even start development, with specific attention to zoning without the need for conversion. Thanks to DSUD and to the Anti-Red Tape Authority, continuous meetings are currently being undertaken to find more permanent solutions to improve the regulatory environment. Another area is the government should encourage private sector participation by offering the tax incentives for engaging in economic and low-cost housing development. Then there should be affordable and sustainable housing finance, not just for the low-income buyers or borrowers, but for developers should have the assurance of ease and on-time takeout of the buyer's housing loans. Next, please. SHEDA believes the government should give equal or more importance to the housing industry as compared to its build infra projects, which have to secure the approval of NEDA from the Investment Coordination Committee, which go through stringent bidding processes, lengthy and costly right-of-way negotiations, and require massive government funding. On the other hand, housing provided by the private sector does not require government funding or economic stimulus to mobilize or undertake projects. It brings immediate positive impact to the economy. Housing provides shelter, which is a basic need for life, for a quality life. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Ms. Rosie. Now, we do have a very limited time for questions. To read the questions, Yusek Rosemary, Director Wengser Mars, and Ms. Rosie, I'll be reading just two questions, and maybe one of you can just answer them. For those who are tuning in who have been sending their questions, don't worry, we will collate all these questions, and hopefully the organizers can send them back or post them somewhere with answers. So I'll just ask quickly, perhaps from the representatives of our government. There's one question that perhaps you guys can answer. Given these studies we've seen, what do you think does the government need? What do you think? What does the government think would be the most practical step in solving this crisis, especially that there is a challenge already of getting enough resources to close the gap? Maybe Director Wang can answer, or Yusek Rose. Ma'am, yes, po. We don't hear you, ma'am. I think your audio is still off, po.
Okay, sorry. You've mentioned that we're closing the gap because of the finance resources, but I think most of the speakers here will agree with me that the housing sector is really into buying right now, because for the past 10 years, we've been receiving, and until to date, we have only less than 1% of the total budget of the government to address the housing sector needs. So I think there's really a need for the sector, or there's really a need for a paradigm shift from the government, as mentioned by Ms. Rosie Chai earlier, relative to the build bid vis-a-vis the housing sector. And this was also per pronouncement by the congressman during the plenary of our hearing in the budget, that the housing sector should not be should be a precondition prior to any build program. It's not the other way around. So I think it's incumbent on the government really, especially on the financing side, that we really have to address this gap, the financing gap, particularly if we really want to address the ODC, or the unserved sector in the housing. So that's it.
Ma'am, Yusek, Rosemary, would you like to share something too?
Yeah, I feel I should say something as well. I will not be addressing this issue of the build versus the housing. That's actually a very long discussion. Of course, I will always argue that you really need to be able to provide the public goods, okay, before anything else, because if you do not have the public goods, we have a very huge infrastructure backlog in the Philippines, and it's actually limiting our capacity to grow. But with respect to the housing, and we're talking about the financing side of housing, the issue is really very, very complex. And I've already mentioned some of them. Dr. Stan mentioned some of them. It's actually time that we, take a step back, and we're even looking at it more holistically in the light of this COVID-19 pandemic. For instance, we are also actually the vice chair of the Balik Probinsya Bagong Pag-asa program, because we really think that it's this is no longer an acceptable situation for us, that we have too much congestion in the urban areas. But our fear, though, is that if we just go on with this program without much planning, then again we have a big problem ahead of us. And so what we also want to happen before anything else is actually a national land use policy, because so far we do not have it yet. There has been many proposals, many proposed bills in Congress actually, and it has not seen the light of day. So many opposing views on it, and in fact, what we hope to do, I think there will be a last ditch effort in this Congress to come up with a national land use policy. Absent that, actually, the president is really convinced that that should be the way to go. Because even for this balik probinsya bagong pag-asa, what we really want to happen is, we go full speed on this only when we have laid down this policy environment in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So quickly, the next question will be going to Miss Rosie and Sir Mars. During this time, and of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, how do you think the government can create an environment that more effectively allows the private sector, civil society, and NGOs to contribute to the solutions? We've seen, how the pandemic has actually burdened an already burdened industry. So would you like to just give your thoughts quickly?
Mars, would you like to go first? Because that was actually a huge part of my talk.
Well, number one is OSHDAP has been advocating for a review of regulation together with ARTA. We think that this will go in a long way because these are unusual times, and we have to have the production as soon as possible because we are racing against loss of capability of workers and artisans, for example, who have gone home, some of them in the provinces. So there must be some change in regulation because these are unusual times, and ARTA is very, very much supportive of this. In fact, they have, 3 times a week sessions, and housing has been identified after telcos, after all of these connectivity problems, as an important sector that has to be addressed. And we thank the government and ARTA in particular for this. This is a step in the right direction. This is something that the government can easily do from the point of view of permitting, from the point of view of financing even, and from the point of view even of really simple regulations. We just have to keep the production going. There's no alternative to that. Otherwise, all of us will be stalled, and we just have to keep moving. Otherwise, as NEDA and the government has correctly prescribed, there would be a significant number of Filipinos who will fall into the poverty line. That's how I see it.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to
Hamela.
Yes.
May I add, please? Okay. Please. Actually, the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development Secretary Del Rosario has time and again emphasized that the government cannot undertake the national housing program without the private sector. The way we're feeling right now, especially because of the effect of COVID-19, many developers are badly affected. However, it is not hopeless, simply because, as Mars said, the housing industry contributes to close to 5 million workers, and we need more players in the industry to be able to catch up with the demand. The supply could not basically catch up fast enough. So with the government help, especially on the regulatory environment, just to improve it, and likewise to provide tax incentives for housing developers to want to engage in socialized housing development, even if it were a compliance. The government should actually provide for tax incentives. Otherwise, like what had been happening for the past 2 years, because as I mentioned a while ago, the price adjustment could not really compensate for the increase in design standards, and many developers opted for alternative options in compliance participation, which does not result in housing production. Simply because they just cannot make ends meet. To add to that, operating expenses, administrative expenses, the carrying costs of delays. As I mentioned, for a 10-hectare project, it would take 5 to 7 years. And there's so many challenges that we face, from the buyers to the homeowners association down the line, not even just with the government. So the housing sector is appealing to the government. We need to help each other. We are committed to work with the government to provide housing for even the marginalized sector of the population. Well, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rose. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time anymore for more questions. I'm seeing more questions actually coming in still. So Lala, I think, can collate all these questions and send them back to you. Now I'll move on to Ms. Lily Fuentes to handle the closing part of this program. She's the Chief Operating Officer of Habitats for Humanity Philippines.
Thank you, Jamela. Good morning, everyone. What has transpired in the last hour and a half is a stirring discussion that highlights the gravity and urgency of the housing issue in the country. I have the tall task of summarizing the very interesting and informative discussion that we just witnessed. I hope I can do justice and capture the highlights of the discussion in 4 minutes. From the study, we heard the increasing housing demand that can reach to 15 million by 2022, of which 11 million belongs to the unserved segment and the socialized housing segment. However, housing production for socialized housing continuously declined since 2018. Moreover, SHEDA shared that the private sector shifted focus from mass housing to upper-class housing. The housing crisis is further intensified by COVID-19 pandemic, as surfaced in the housing market system study, with the cancellation or postponement of housing projects, including owner-driven construction. The pandemic has resulted to 50% to 80% revenue loss for the construction manufacturers and retailers, loss of jobs, and displacement of construction laborers. What was promising and an eye-popping data presented was the undercount contribution of 1.3 trillion pesos or $29 billion of the housing sector to the economy. This presents an opportunity for private, government, investors, and CSOs to consider housing as an important investment to resuscitate the Philippine economy post-COVID-19. With the present scenario and conditions, the Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022 and Ambisyon Nating 2040 target is unlikely to be met. As we've heard from the discussion, there is a need for everyone to work together to change these conditions by, first, injecting cash, safety net support, and stimulus packages for the housing sector is needed to be able to achieve these targets. More precisely, the government needs to prioritize housing and increase its housing budget, which is currently at a meager 0.8% of the national budget. Providing more conducive climate for housing activities such as ease of doing business, fiscal incentives to housing developers, streamlining, digitalization, and fast-tracking permitting and licensing processes, establishment of HOPCs or housing one-stop processing centers, providing direct subsidies and affordable, inclusive, and sustainable housing finance, including microfinance. Government to look into the development and management of idle lands, takeover of undeveloped and abandoned subdivisions, manage and oversee the development of proclaimed sites on the implementation of public housing and other innovative, timely, and relevant programs for the lower income groups, including owner-driven construction, high-density housing, rental housing, and similar programs. Protect the employment of around 1.5 million artisans and construction workers, as they will be a huge loss with their rated capacity contributing to the housing sector. Housing is a complex issue that needs a whole of society approach, stronger coordination and collaboration between the private, public, and non-profit actors can revitalize the sector of immediate action if immediate action is taken to boost demand and supply in housing market systems. As stated by Luis, we need each other as partners. Be it this moment of global crisis or for a sustainable future, let us work together to achieve the goal that every Filipino has a decent place to live. We came together today to talk about the gravity and the urgent need for housing. The need is great. Together we can do more because we need to do more. As we draw to a close, let me introduce you to the COO of Mega World Corporation and Habitat for Humanity Philippines National Board of Trustees, Ms. Lourdes Gutierrez Alfonso. Over to you, Lou.
Thank you, Lily. Safe, secure, and adequate housing is more urgent now than more than ever. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Listening from the thought-provoking more than half and a half hour discussion, we reaffirm our conviction that improved housing conditions not only save lives, prevent diseases, and reduce poverty. It is also a driver to stimulate economic revival and social development. We have heard this from the studies presented by Naeem Raswani and Dr. Winston Padoginog, strongly corroborated by the panel reactors. It was indeed a very informative discussion. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of Habitat for Humanity Philippines, we are so grateful to the speakers, Undersecretary Rosemary Edilion of NEDA, Director Rowena De Niros of DHSUD, and my colleagues in the private sector, Marcelino Mendoza of OSHDAP, and Rosie Chai of SHDA. This forum would not have been as exciting and enjoyable without Janela Alindogan moderating the serious and critical housing topic. Habitat Philippines is also thankful to Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter and the Center of Research and Communications Foundation of University of Asia and Pacific for spearheading the two housing studies and co-organizing the first BAHAYnihan forum. The success of this inaugural event would not have been possible without everyone's support and active participation. But our involvement does not end here. We have a tall task ahead of us, and as Luis has mentioned, this is not a problem anyone can solve alone. We need to work together, collaborate, and through partnership, address the housing issues faced by millions of Filipino families. Let us strengthen our conviction to build safe and decent homes, empower one community at a time, and in the process, impact the lives of our families, creating more people like Joanne, one who thrives towards a brighter future through having a home as a foundation to achieve her dream. Thank you once again for your participation. We will see you all in January BAHAYnihan Forum. Until then, let us reflect on how individually we can contribute to the solution of inadequate housing, how our organization can start investing in housing for the unserved segment, and how we can rise together stronger and more resilient through housing. Thank you, everyone, and God bless us all.